All my family flew 15 states over, from New Jersey to California, to attend my sister's unborn twins' gender reveal party. A month later, none showed up at my wedding. They claimed the 2-hour drive would be too tiring for them. They never called nor texted after my wedding. This went on for exactly 34 days. But then the following day, my phone began to violently detonate with incoming calls, text messages, and frantic voicemails from every single one of them. What might have shaken the foundations of their fairy tale world so suddenly? Keep watching to see how my family reacted when they realized too late that they had, by their own actions, sold their golden goose to an Eskimo.
I was standing on the periphery of a lavish, rented beachfront cabana in Malibu, California, shielding my eyes from the glaring Pacific sun, when I finally understood that the hierarchy within my family was not a temporary phase, but a permanent, unalterable institution. It was the second Saturday in June, and my entire extended family, my parents, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, and a half-dozen cousins, had joyfully coordinated flights across 15 states, traveling all the way from the humid suburbs of New Jersey to the pristine coast of Southern California to attend my younger sister Chloe's gender reveal party for her unborn twins. My parents had spared absolutely no expense for this monumental occasion, funding first-class tickets for themselves, securing luxury oceanfront hotel suites for the extended relatives, and hiring a professional event planner who had orchestrated a display of sheer, unadulterated excess that culminated in a rented helicopter dropping biodegradable pink and blue confetti over the ocean, while a hired string quartet played pop covers on the sand. My father, a man who routinely complained about the physical toll of his mild arthritis, had practically sprinted through Newark Airport to make his connection, and my mother had spent 3 solid weeks agonizing over the perfect designer pastel outfit to wear for the professional photographer Chloe had flown in from Los Angeles. I had also made the trip, quietly purchasing my own economy ticket and booking a modest Airbnb a few miles inland, because I had still harbored the naive, exhausting illusion that showing up for my family would eventually result in them showing up for me. I spent the entire afternoon observing them from the edge of the cabana, watching my parents fawn over Chloe and her husband Greg, a man whose manufactured charm barely concealed his towering arrogance and deeply precarious financial reality. Exactly 4 weeks and 2 days after that sun-drenched spectacle in Malibu, I sat in the bridal suite of a quiet, elegant estate nestled in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror, while my phone screen remained entirely devoid of notifications from the people who shared my last name. It was my wedding day. The venue was exactly a 2-hour and 15-minute drive from my parents' house in New Jersey, a straight shot down the interstate through familiar, easy terrain, yet the 50 chairs carefully arranged on the left side of the aisle. The chairs designated for my family were completely and utterly empty. 3 days prior, my mother had called me, her voice dripping with that specific, practiced tone of superficial regret that people use when they have already absolved themselves of any guilt, to inform me that the drive was simply going to be too taxing for them. "Your father's back is just acting up terribly, sweetheart, and after all that exhausting travel to California last month, we are just entirely drained," she had said, entirely unbothered by the astronomical hypocrisy of her statement. When I quietly pointed out that they had willingly flown 3,000 miles across the country for a party announcing the gender of children who hadn't even been born yet, but were now claiming that a 2-hour drive to witness their eldest daughter get married was an insurmountable physical hardship, she sighed heavily into the receiver. "Please don't be difficult, Elena," she had reprimanded me, shifting the blame with the practiced ease of a career narcissist. "Chloe's pregnancy is high risk, and we needed to be there to support her. A wedding is just a party. We'll send a nice gift, but you really shouldn't be so selfish as to demand we put your father's health at risk for a 2-hour car ride." By the end of that day, my aunts and uncles had all conveniently formulated their own miraculously synchronized excuses. A sudden summer cold, a scheduling conflict with a golf tournament, a vague mention of car trouble, until it became glaringly obvious that a collective decision had been made that my wedding simply did not warrant their effort. They had always viewed me as the pragmatic, unremarkable sibling, the one who didn't demand attention, who didn't throw tantrums, and who consequently didn't require appeasement. When I introduced them to my fiancé David, a quiet, meticulously observant man who dressed entirely in unbranded earth tones and drove a 5-year-old sedan. They had collectively dismissed him as a mundane administrative worker who perfectly matched my supposedly mundane life. They asked him no questions, showed no interest in his background, and patronized him with the same condescending politeness they reserved for waiters and valet drivers. I never corrected their assumptions, nor did David, because we both understood that their lack of curiosity was a symptom of their own self-absorption. I did not cry in the bridal suite that morning. I did not throw my phone across the room, or succumb to the crushing weight of their rejection, because the grief had already been processed 1,000 times over during my childhood, and what was left in its wake was a profound, crystalline clarity. I realized that attempting to extract unconditional love from people who view affection as a currency to be spent exclusively on those who enhance their social standing is a fool's errand. I smoothed the lace of my bodice, picked up my bouquet of white ranunculus, and walked out of that room with the absolute certainty that the family I was born into had just voluntarily permanently severed the cord, completely unaware of the monumental miscalculation they had just made regarding the quiet man I was about to marry. The ceremony took place in the terraced gardens of the estate under a canopy of ancient willow trees, and as I walked down the aisle toward David, I consciously refused to let my gaze drift toward the 50 empty wooden chairs on the left side of the lawn, focusing entirely on the profound warmth in his eyes and the steadfast presence of the friends and mentors who had actually shown up to celebrate our life together. The wedding was incredibly beautiful, intimate, and profoundly peaceful, completely devoid of the chaotic, performative anxiety that usually accompanied any event involving my parents or my sister. What my family fundamentally failed to understand, entirely due to their own deliberate, arrogant ignorance, was that the quiet, unassuming man waiting for me at the altar was not the mid-level corporate drone they had smugly assumed him to be. David is the founder and principal managing partner of Horizon Ventures, one of the most aggressive and highly capitalized technology investment firms on the East Coast. He possesses a personal net worth that makes my parents' upper-middle-class suburban posturing look like child's play, and he wields a level of absolute, decisive authority in the corporate sector that men like my brother-in-law Greg spend their entire lives desperately trying to proximity themselves to. The magnificent private estate where we were currently getting married, which my mother had dismissively assumed was some budget-friendly public park when I sent her the address, was actually David's own property, a sweeping 70-acre sanctuary that he maintained with quiet, understated pride. We had intentionally kept the details of our financial and professional realities entirely concealed from my family, not out of malice, but out of a shared, necessary boundary of self-preservation. I knew precisely how my parents operated. If they had known the true extent of David's influence, their entirely absent interest in me would have violently transformed into an obsessive, suffocating campaign to leverage his wealth for their own social elevation and Chloe's endless financial demands. They would have paraded him at country club dinners, bragged about him to their superficial friends, and relentlessly pressured us to fund whatever lifestyle upgrades they deemed necessary for their manufactured image. Most importantly, I knew that Greg's deeply troubled tech startup, a company he had relentlessly boasted about at every family gathering to mask its staggering operational failures, was currently bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate and desperately seeking a Series B funding injection to avoid total bankruptcy. For the past 18 months, Greg had been obsessively trying to secure a pitch meeting with the elusive executive team at Horizon Ventures, constantly complaining to my parents about the impenetrable wall of gatekeepers preventing him from accessing the firm's legendary CEO, a man whose face was rarely photographed for industry publications, and who preferred to operate strictly behind the scenes. My family had spent hours at dining tables lamenting Greg's bad luck, completely oblivious to the fact that the man they were so desperately trying to reach was sitting quietly at the end of that very same table, eating a bread roll and listening to them insult his fiancée's career choices.
As David slipped the platinum band onto my finger and the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, I felt a massive, invisible weight lift off my shoulders, the final severing of an emotional chain that had dragged behind me for 3 decades. The reception that followed was a masterpiece of culinary excellence and genuine, unforced joy, filled with brilliant, kind people who knew us deeply and valued our characters over our utility. We drank vintage champagne, danced under an endless canopy of stars, and celebrated without a single moment of manufactured drama or familial obligation. Late in the evening, as the last of the guests were departing and the catering staff was quietly packing away the silver, David and I stood on the stone terrace overlooking the dark, tranquil expanse of the private lake, entirely enveloped in the quiet perfection of our new reality. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, rested his chin on the top of my head, and asked me if I was okay with how the day had unfolded, given the glaring physical absence of the people who were supposed to love me the most. I leaned back into his embrace, looked at the meticulously manicured grounds of our home, and told him the absolute truth. Their absence was the greatest wedding gift they could have possibly given me, because it permanently eradicated any lingering guilt I might have felt for what was inevitably going to happen next. I had spent my entire life trying to contort myself into a shape that my parents might find acceptable, minimizing my own achievements to avoid overshadowing my sister, and enduring their casual cruelties in the desperate hope that biology would eventually mandate affection. By refusing to drive 2 hours to watch me marry the love of my life, simply because they couldn't be bothered to exert the effort for the overlooked child, they had finally, explicitly, shown me exactly where I stood in their ledger of priorities. They had drawn a permanent, uncrossable line in the sand, and I was entirely at peace with staying on my side of it forever, especially knowing that the collision course between their suffocating arrogance and David's absolute professional authority was now locked in, inescapable, and ticking down like a metronome toward a spectacular, unavoidable confrontation. Exactly 34 days after our wedding, the carefully constructed facade of my sister's perfect life and my parents' unearned superiority violently collided with the concrete reality of the business world, when Greg finally, miraculously, secured his desperate pitch meeting at Horizon Ventures. According to the completely detached clinical account David gave me later that evening, Greg had swaggered into the spectacular glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of the firm's Manhattan headquarters, wearing an aggressive bespoke suit, flanked by 2 nervous junior associates, entirely prepared to deliver the presentation that would supposedly save his sinking company from total financial ruin. He had spent the first 10 minutes confidently setting up his slides and attempting to charm the senior partners, completely oblivious to the fact that the quiet man sitting at the absolute head of the massive mahogany table, reviewing the financial disclosures with an expression of mild professional boredom, was the same man he had refused to make eye contact with at Thanksgiving for the past 3 years. When David finally closed the dossier, steepled his fingers, and looked up to address the room, the color drained from Greg's face with such terrifying speed that one of the partners instinctively reached for the water pitcher, assuming the man was experiencing a sudden cardiac event. David did not raise his voice, nor did he make a single personal comment or bring up the wedding. He simply proceeded to methodically, surgically, and entirely objectively dismantle the catastrophic structural flaws in Greg's business model, pointing out the unsustainable burn rate, the inflated user acquisition metrics, and the glaring lack of proprietary technology. He treated Greg exactly the way he would treat any deeply unqualified applicant, delivering a masterclass in professional execution that ended with a calm, polite, and absolute refusal to invest a single dollar of Horizon's capital into a fundamentally doomed enterprise. Greg was escorted out of the building in a state of catatonic shock, and within exactly 2 hours, my cell phone, which had remained peacefully silent from my family's end for over a month, began to violently detonate with incoming calls, text messages, and frantic voicemails. I was sitting on the back porch of our estate with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the afternoon sun filter through the oak trees, when I finally decided to answer the 14th consecutive call from my mother. Her voice, usually so composed and dripping with practiced condescension, was a shrill, hysterical mess of panic and deeply transparent manipulation, as she desperately tried to weave a narrative where they had always adored David, where there had simply been a terrible misunderstanding about the wedding, and where I, as a loyal daughter and sister, needed to immediately intervene and force my husband to reverse his decision to save Chloe's future. Elena, darling, you have to understand. Greg is entirely ruined without this funding. They'll lose the house, the twins are coming. You cannot let David do this to your own family. She wept, entirely forgetting that just 5 weeks earlier she had explicitly told me that I was selfish for expecting them to endure a 2-hour car ride to watch me get married. I let her speak, let her exhaust herself against the impenetrable wall of my silence, and then I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the absolute stillness of the air around me. I spoke into the receiver with a voice so profoundly calm and detached that it sounded like a stranger to my own ears. My family, I said slowly, emphasizing the word so it hung heavily in the digital space between us, consists of my husband and the people who actually showed up to celebrate our union. You made it abundantly clear that a 2-hour drive was simply too exhausting a journey to support me, so I am absolutely certain you will understand that walking all the way to my husband's home office to ask him to compromise his billion-dollar firm for a man who couldn't even RSVP to our wedding is simply too taxing on my energy. I hung up the phone, blocked her number, blocked my father's number, blocked Chloe's number, and systematically severed every digital and social tie connecting me to the people who had raised me, finalizing the boundary that they themselves had initiated. The fallout was total and irreversible. Greg's startup officially filed for bankruptcy 3 months later, forcing my parents to drastically dip into their beloved retirement savings to bail out Chloe's mortgage, effectively ending their days of extravagant cross-country flights and performative country club wealth. I have spent the subsequent years reflecting on what I would tell anyone who finds themselves perpetually positioned as the afterthought in their own family, the child expected to absorb endless disrespect while continuously offering unquestioning loyalty. Blood does not mandate submission, and sharing a last name does not require you to permanently anchor yourself to people who view your existence as an inconvenience until it becomes an asset. When people show you that their love is conditional, transactional, and entirely dependent on what you can do for their public image, you must believe them the very first time, and you must give yourself the profound, liberating permission to stop auditioning for a role they never intended to cast you in. You do not owe your success to the people who ignored you in the dark, and you absolutely do not owe them a seat at the table once you have built your own castle in the light. Your greatest revenge is not anger or confrontation. It is absolute, unbothered peace. A peace achieved by quietly stepping out of their toxic narrative and allowing the natural consequences of their own arrogance to completely and utterly dismantle them, while you sit quietly on your porch, drinking tea, and watching the sun set over a life they will never, ever be a part of.